Hello, here we are again. We're going to continue our reading War of the Invisibles by Sally Pearson Dillon. And we're going to get started, okay? Are you ready? Let's begin. I don't want you to go, Professor Huss, Janessa explained. It's too dangerous, and you have many enemies now. Professor Huss laughed. Don't be afraid, Jessica, he said. Look at how the Lord has taken care of me thus far. The bishops were angry with me and wanted to take me to trial in Rome, but the king and queen protected me. They had to have the trial without me, and they sentenced without me. They weren't able to figure out how to have an execution without me, so they skipped that part. They all laughed. Yes, Uncle Jerome said, God has been good to us, but Janessa is right. There are dangers out there. Well, Professor Huss said, Emperor Sigismund has promised to give me safe passage to appear before the council in Constance. The emperor himself is going to be there. I trust him. And who would dare disobey his promise? They all looked at each other. We'll pray for your safety, Uncle Jerome said. I will go with you, Janessa said. You'll need somebody to come along and take care of you. After some protesting, Janessa got her wish. Later, she wrote back to Uncle Jerome from Constance. It was amazing, Uncle Jerome. It was just like those pictures Professor Huss's friends painted. When the emperor arrived in Constance, there were more than 100,000 foreigners in the city. Some 36,000 beds were set up for people still coming, and there were at least 30,000 horses in the city. The Pope is here, and he has brought 600 people. The emperor brought 4,000 people. There are 30 cardinals here, 4 patriarchs, and 2 of the Pope's legates, and each of them has a whole herd of attendants. There are 27 archbishops, 206 bishops, 33 titular bishops, and 150 other important people, and 203 abbots. And each of them has a whole herd of people taking care of them too. And each of them has a whole herd. The city is just packed with all these pompous people and their bodyguards and their servants and the servants of their servants and the servants of their servants of the servants. Fine clothes and jewelry are everywhere. Then came Professor Huss with me and his 2 friends, walking and carrying our few belongings with us. You would have laughed. It was just like the paintings. More later. Love, Janessa. Constance, Baden-Württemberg, A.D. 1415. The guardians and I drew close to Jessica and her little band all day. We reminded them of how God had taken care of them in the past. We knew that they would need to remember these things very soon. Suddenly there was a crash, and the door flew open. Soldiers poured into the room. Professor Huss stood. Gentlemen, he said, what is the meaning of this? You're under arrest, one of the soldiers replied. That can't be, Professor Huss protested. I have a promise of safe passage from my king. I have it in writing. The soldier glanced at the paper and then flung it on the floor. Yes, he said. Emperor Sigismund may have promised that, but the Pope didn't. We're here on his orders, and you are in big trouble. Ah, Professor Huss said, a look of understanding dawning across his face. He said nothing else. Janessa shook silently as they led him away. She was too numb to cry. She followed at the safe distance to see where they would have taken him. I will find out information, she whispered to the other followers. Is there a way for me to visit him and to take him food? However, when she got to the jail, she was turned away at the door. No visitors allowed to heretics, the guard growled. Will they feed him? She asked, knowing that many people in prison didn't eat unless family or friends brought them food. It doesn't matter, laughed another soldier. Go away and forget about this. Janessa paled. She set her chin firmly. She determined in her heart that every time the shift changed, there would be new guards she would request to visit Professor Huss and to see if someone would let her in. Janessa returned to the rented rooms and slumped into a chair, exhausted. It had been 3 days since Professor Huss had been arrested. The jailers would still not allow her to visit him. The two friends who had traveled there with her and Professor Huss would be home soon. She started to make a fire in the fireplace. The door opened and she sprang to her feet. "What did you find out?" she asked. "Nothing yet," said one grimly as he turned to the other. "We must draw up a petition at least. We must ask for him to be released on bail, or he will die before he ever gets trial in that prison. Word has it that he's not being fed." Janessa sank back into her chair. The two men pored over their petition all evening. Had it been ready to present to the courts in the morning? The petition was then presented to the council the next day, signed by several of the most distinguished noblemen in Bohemia. The court considered it and sent 4 bishops and 2 lords to the prison to try to talk to Professor Huss to recanting his position. "He won't recant," Janessa said. "I know he won't. He believes what God said in the scriptures, and he will not back down now." The noblemen shook their heads hopelessly. "I think we should watch the streets," they said. "If he does not recant, they plan to bring him before the court and the emperor. We may be able to see him as he goes by." The guardians and I pulled close, trying to infuse the little group of believers with as much strength as we could for what they were about to face. Sure enough, Professor Huss was brought from the council. Janessa looked at the ground. She couldn't even bear to look at him. They had stripped him of his priest's robes that he usually wore when he was teaching. To degrade and embarrass him, they put a paper crown on his head with devils painted all over it and a sign that said, "Ringleader of Heretics." Professor Huss, however, walked with great dignity. He held his head high and he looked almost joyful. He was paraded through the streets to the emperor, who sent him on to the duke. The crowds followed into the streets to see what would happen next. There seemed to be a gathering of the gates at the church. Janessa stood on the edge of the little wall, trying to see what was happening. There were people throwing books in front of the gate. She realized that these were books Professor Huss had written. Suddenly there was a puff of smoke and a cheer from the crowd. They were burning his books. At least they were not burning him, she thought. The procession moved on to the edge of town. A stake was fastened to the ground with chains and piles of wood next to it. Janessa's heart sank. "Oh God," she whispered silently. "Aren't you going to save him? Won't you save my professor? Please help him." Professor Huss looked over at Janessa. He smiled and looked very relaxed. The soldiers grabbed the rusty chain and wrapped it around him, securing him to the stake. "Jesus was bound with worse chains than this for my sake," he said. "Why should I be ashamed of this little rusty one?" Janessa understood. Professor Huss was going to die. If she was going to help, it would be to help him die bravely. She pushed toward the front of the crowd and smiled at him. He smiled back at her. Professor Huss said softly, "Jesus was wrapped in a robe that wasn't his when he was on trial. They took away his clothes too. Jesus wore a crown of thorns for me. I can wear this dunce cap for him." He continued to smile and looked very calm as they piled the wood around his feet. Then they lit the fire. Instead of screaming, Professor Huss began to sing. Janessa started to pray, "Oh God, please help him to be brave. Please help him not to hurt." Huss sang louder and louder. The higher the flames went, the higher his song went, until all was quiet. Janessa fell to her knees. "Oh, thank you, Jesus," she whispered. If the professor had been able to sing clear to the end, that meant God had given him extra courage and had stopped the pain enough so that he could sing praises. "You are so good," she continued. "Just wait till I tell Uncle Jerome." Almost a year had passed. Janessa had been taken in by a noble family when her Uncle Jerome was arrested. Even though the emperor had promised safety to Professor Huss, he had not stood up to the Pope and the council in the end. Now Uncle Jerome was in their power too. He had been in prison for 340 days. Janessa's spirits were good. The guardians had strengthened her, and her loyalty was unshaken. "Oh God," she prayed before learning that Uncle Jerome's trial, "you know many of your enemies are pretending to be friends of yours, and yet they are just trying to build up their own power and kill anybody that gets in their way. Please be with my Uncle Jerome. If there's any way to save him, please do that. But if he is going to die, please help him to be brave, as our friend the professor was. And God, please help him not to hurt. I love him so much." Janessa looked peaceful as she got up from her knees and joined the line in the streets with the others who were waiting to see what had happened. Before long, a roar came over the crowd. Uncle Jerome was being dragged from the council chamber. He was wearing the same paper cap painted with red devils. Uncle Jerome stopped and spoke. "Our Lord Jesus Christ, when he suffered death for me, a most miserable sinner, wore a crown of thorns on his head, and I, for his sake, will wear this cap." The Cardinal of Florence tried again to talk to him into giving up his beliefs and cooperating with the powerful leaders. Jerome said no and began to sing. Janessa smiled. "He knows how comforting it was to me that Professor Huss sang clear to the end. It's Uncle Jerome's way of letting me know God is giving him courage." Uncle Jerome sang all the way to the spot where Professor Huss had been burned. Then he knelt down and prayed. The crowd was silent as they listened for each word. Then he hugged the stake cheerfully. The soldiers fastened him to it. Janessa's stomach hurt, but she kept her chin up bravely as she watched, for the Lord was answering her prayers and making Uncle Jerome brave. As the executioner sneaked up behind to light the wood, Uncle Jerome said, "Come around to the front. You can light it in front of me, for if I were afraid of this, I would have never come here to Constance." The fire was lit, and Uncle Jerome began to sing again. There was no screaming and no crying. The last words he sang were, "This soul in flames I offer, Christ, to thee." Janessa was shaking, and her fists were clenched, but she was proud of Uncle Jerome, and she was proud of her God, who could get his people through the worst executions without a cry of pain. God has answered her prayer, and she knew, without a doubt, she would serve him as long as she lived. Thank you for joining in today, and we will continue this in the next video. So like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next video comes out. Alrighty, our next chapter begins, chapter 6, Max, University of Wittenberg, AD 1517. Join me then.